The better you know the individuals you're working with, the better you can effectively communicate with them.
Today we're chatting to Ryan Davies to get his insight onto how to effectively communicate with players.
Effective communication's about positively impacting others through your words and your actions, but while also being able to carefully listen. As a coach, you were there to help the players, whether you're winning 4-0 or losing 4-0. If you're confident with what it is that you were delivering, that will allow you to communicate much more effectively.
What's the most important thing for a coach to kind of remember when they're going to communicate with their players?
I think...
Hello and welcome to Coachcast by England Football Learning, the coaching podcast that brings you insight from people across the game. As always, I'm Jamie and I'm here with Louise, and today we're chatting to Ryan Davies, an FA Physical Education Officer, to get his insight onto how to effectively communicate with players. Well, hi Ryan, welcome back to the show again. How are you?
I'm great, thanks Jamie. Thank you both for having me back. Really looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's always great to have you on. So we'll just start as we always do, and we'll just find out a little bit more about your role for anybody who hasn't listened to an episode that you've been on so far. Can you tell us what it is that you do?
Yeah, so as Jamie said, I'm a physical education officer, part of the wider coach development team here at England Football. In my role, I work with teachers and trainee teachers and the coaches from the community arms of the professional football clubs to support them in their delivery of high quality PE, and also work with the wider coaching and coach development workforce, hopefully helping them to give really positive experiences to the players and the coaches that they're working with.
Lovely.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks again for that little recap, Ryan. And as you know, after that recap, we always dive into a little bit of a top tip feature before we get into the main interview, because coaches could ultimately be on the way to training while tuning into this, and we want to give them some good advice at the top of the show.
Yeah, you always give us really good tips, so we're going to ask you for some more again, but we're going to ask you to give us as many of those tips in 30 seconds. Are you up for that challenge?
Absolutely, of course, let's do it.
Okay, once the music starts, you can begin.
Okay, so I think whoever you are coaching, make sure that the session is fun and engaging for them. And if you aren't sure if something is fun and engaging, then the best thing to do is ask the players, because at the end of the day, football is about them and doing everything we can to make them excited to come back time after time. Secondly, I think having a clear focus for both you and the players means that everybody knows exactly what you're going after over a period of time. And finally, make sure that what you're delivering is age and stage appropriate, giving the players lots of opportunities to play, explore, solve problems and have lots of fun.
Incredible.
Absolutely perfect. You can tell you've done this before.
Yeah, bang on to time yet again, and as always, Ryan. Well, we'll dive into the main part of the show. And, actually, I think last time that you joined us was actually back in March 2024. So it's been a little while since you were last on. So how have you been since we last spoke to you?
Yeah, been great, thanks Jamie. And I was getting a bit nervous about whether I was going to get the call up again, so thanks for having me back. It does feel like a long time ago, and a lot has sort of happened since then, but it's been another fantastic year, and truly enjoyed every single second of being able to do a job that I absolutely love and work across lots of different projects and areas of the game.
Do you think that you've had any particular learnings that you'd like to share with our listeners that you've had since we had you last on?
Yeah, so I think, I mentioned to you last time that, I've been working in and around some of the England para squads, supporting camps with the partially sighted squad and the cerebral palsy squad. And, that work led me to have the opportunity to be asked to step in as the interim head coach of the power chair team for the summer of 2024 to lead them into the Home Nations tournament up in Scotland. So, for me, wearing the three lions is the greatest honour you can have. So to be given the privilege of being England head coach was just a dream come true, and, an experience which I'll forever cherish. And, getting to work alongside Rob Seal and Steve Daly, it was a fantastic experience to work with some of the best players in the world, and to go up to Scotland and win the Home Nations Championship was just a brilliant experience that I learned so much from. And, as well as that, it's also been great to continue to work with coaches and players in the England Para Talent Pathway across all the teams. And, I can promise everybody listening that it's only a matter of time before we are consistently winning World Cups and Euros across the board, because there's some unbelievable talent coming through in every squad. So obviously loads of learning experiences from that. And then within the PE team, we're currently having a real focus on supporting heads of PE within secondary schools and supporting them with their curriculum design and ensuring as many pupils as possible get access to real high quality PE and football within their time at secondary school, which, hopefully in turn will lead them to having a future in the game in whatever environment is appropriate to them. Also been fortunate enough to work on a couple of projects within coach development since we last spoke. So one of those being Play Phase, which is focusing on supporting those working with children at the start of their football journey, aged 4 to 6 years old, and also the Coaching Disabled Footballers programme, which includes an online module and a face-to-face workshop that we deliver through the county FAs, supported by the fantastic team of disability mentors. So it's been a really busy period, having been involved in both those projects, but certainly very rewarding to see those ideas and hard work come to fruition in the form of resources which are hopefully helping coaches to support their players to the best of their ability. So having that opportunity and privilege to work across a wide range of projects and environments is, I think, probably biggest learning I would say is just confirmed what we all know, which is ultimately that coaching is simply about helping people, whether that's England players or 4-year-olds or disabled players or school children. If we can have that positive impact on their lives, no matter how small it is, then that's success as a coach. And I think it's really important for the coaches and teachers who are listening to remember the influence they have, whether that is helping an England player to win an international tournament or just making a 5-year-old laugh so that they want to come back to football or PE next week. I think, just making sure that we never forget that positive feeling that we can give to people. And every time that you have a group in front of you, that positive impact you can have, then that's something that they'll never forget.
Very eloquently put at the end as well, like just in terms of like the impact that coaches can have, and you've certainly had a massive impact since we've last spoke to you. That's an incredible amount of stuff that you've actually got across in the last year or so since you was last on. Firstly, obviously, congratulations on the Home Nations Championship. Like, how was that experience for yourself?
It was amazing. Like something, when you first start coaching to get the opportunity to be an England head coach is, at the pinnacle of what you can hope to achieve. So, very privileged to be given that opportunity to do that. So, just that experience of being on camp with players and the support team that you have around you and that preparation to play against other nations is just just amazing. And then obviously when you're standing there before a game, the national anthem is playing, it's a moment of great pride. So yeah, something very privileged to have had the opportunity to do.
No, I'm absolutely buzzing for you for that. That's fantastic.
I think it's one of those things as well. It's a testament to how you operate as a coach developer as well. It's like taking all the opportunities that you can get, which is a really good thing to kind of pass on to people, to kind of try different things, and you never know where it can lead you, kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something we talked about last time, just putting yourself out there. And like I said, even last time I spoke to you, I wouldn't have imagined that the work I was doing with the private squads would have led to being an England head coach. So yeah, just putting yourself out there, I think, is probably a big piece of advice just for all coaches listening, because like I said, yeah, you never know where it can lead.
Talking about never knowing where anything can lead and taking opportunities that come, is there anything that's coming up in the near future for yourself?
Yeah, so I think something that's really exciting that we're working on as a coach development team at the moment is the UEFA B youth license, which I think will really help to support those working with players who are developing and learning the game through childhood. As we know and we've spoken about before, it's a critical time in a person's life as they're growing up. So how we support them in their football environments is vital to help them become, not just good players, but good people, and ultimately set them up for, whatever they go on to do in life. So I think the UEFA B license will really help coaches to do that, and it's a really exciting addition to our work. So I think that's a big project, which is something that's coming up, which is really exciting to be a part of.
Very exciting.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing that. Well, Ryan, you've joined us today to give us a bit of an update about what you've been working on since you last spoke, but also to talk about effective communication, which is obviously a key skill for coaches to have. So I suppose to dive into this discussion, what does effective communication mean to you, and why ultimately is it so important to be an effective communicator?
Yeah, I think ultimately effective communication's about, positively impacting others through your words and your actions, but while also being able to carefully listen and process the thoughts and the opinions and actions of others. So, I think if we summarize it like that, I think being an effective communicator aligns directly to a major part of what it means to be an effective coach or teacher. because, as an educator, it's so important to be able to positively influence the people you're working with. Otherwise, there's no point in being there. But some of the things we're going to talk about today, I think it's really clear that, how you communicate in order to get the best out of people may look very different depending on who you're working with and the environment you're in. Because, as we know, every single person you work with as a coach or a teacher is unique. So how you get the best out of them through your communication also has to be unique. And I think that's what makes it such an amazing and powerful skill, but probably also a difficult one and challenging one to master that can take many years. And I know I certainly haven't got there yet in terms of mastering it, but hopefully, just some of the little things we talk about today can have positive influence on some of the coaches who are listening to think about their communication.
If we think about it in terms of your teaching and coaching background, are there any differences in what communication looks like in each of those areas, would you say?
It's a great question. I think, whatever the environment, the better you know the individuals you're working with, the better you can effectively communicate with them. If any of us, take our everyday life, how we communicate with someone when we first meet them will probably be very different to how we will communicate with them if they became a close friend in 10 years, because of everything that you get to know about them. And, I think, in terms of the two environments, I mentioned last time that in my experience, teaching and coaching have become much more aligned than when I was first starting out. And the communication element of that has played a massive part in that, because, when I was growing up, I saw coaches as people who, would potentially scream and shout and were very big characters using primarily command style, whereas a lot of my teachers maybe use different methods such as, question and answer and guided discovery more. However, I think, due to the influence of coaches like Gareth Southgate, Serena Biegman, Graham Potter, and the involvement of coach development, coaches have now used a variety of ways to get the best out of players. And on the whole, I think how coaches communicate with players might look very different now to how it used to, certainly when I was growing up, which was a long time ago. But I think I see quality coaching now as much more of a two-way communication between the coach and the players, rather than the traditional way of a coach telling the players exactly what they want and the players just having to get on with it. And I think that plays a big part in the work we do with the coaches as part of our coach development work.
You kind of mentioned it there, that in terms of that it took you a little while, maybe to kind of learn what communication is needed with your players, and it's obviously a journey that we're still all going on. But so I suppose I don't want to put words in your mouth for what this answer is, but I was just going to ask, did communication come easily to you when you first started teaching, or was it a bit of a learning curve, I suppose?
Definitely a learning curve. A lot of your communication comes from confidence as well as, knowing the people who you're communicating with. That confidence is an integral part of communicating effectively. So, you've asked there about, when I first started out, and if I think back to when I first started teaching and those early classes that I had in front of me, I was certainly, very nervous. I was thinking, I can't believe I've been trusted to and given the responsibility to educate these people who are in front of me. And I think they were probably staring back, looking at my face and thinking the same things, to be honest. But, as a result, I think not having a lot of confidence, my communication wasn't as effective as I would like to have been. If I think of, just remembering one instance from my first year of teaching vividly that I think I still have nightmares about now. I was asked to teach an A-level PE theory class, and I remember the lesson was about the body's aerobic and anaerobic energy systems and submaximal oxygen deficits and lactate accumulation. And, when I was at school myself, my school hadn't offered GCSE or A-level PE, and science definitely wasn't one of my strongest subjects. So to say I was lacking in confidence going into teaching this lesson was a bit of an understatement. And, I was just I remember being just so worried that the students were going to ask me lots of things that I didn't know the answer to. So as a result, I thought the best course of action was almost to learn the lesson like a script. And I remember there was absolutely no two-way dialogue between me and the class, because I was just petrified that if I gave them the slightest opportunity to ask me a question, I wouldn't know the answer to. So I talked to them like a robot for an hour, and it must have been the most horrendous lesson to sit through. So I'll apologise now if there's any members of that A-level class who are listening today. Hopefully my communication's improved a little bit. But I think, it just highlights how important that confidence is. And, if we bring that back to coaching, if you if you're confident with what it is that you were delivering, that will allow you to communicate much more effectively. Whether that's providing fun games in a Wildcat session or up to preparing a professional team to defend in a low block ahead of a big game at the weekend, that confidence in yourself and what you were doing allows you to communicate in a really positive way. And, that particular experience that I've referred to there also taught me that, it's really important to be your authentic self and be comfortable with not knowing the answer to absolutely everything, because players and pupils will soon see through you if you're trying to put on an act.
Other than obviously trying to probably know the material a little bit and obviously giving things a try to gain a little bit more confidence, are there any other quick top tips that our listeners or anyone who's watching this can take away to develop their communication skills?
I think one of the biggest ones is to actually get feedback from the players that you're working with. In terms of how they like to be communicated with. And again, I know keep reiterating it, but the more you get to know someone, you'll find that out for yourself. But also getting feedback from the players, and I think there's definitely times where how you speak to one person or one player in your team might have to be different to another because of how they react to how you're speaking to them. So I think getting to know the players as best as possible and constantly asking them for feedback in terms of what's the best way of communicating. And, particularly, we talked about coaching disabled footballers and, the fact that some of them might have, additional needs and different ways that they need to be communicated in with, but you might not know those unless you've actually found that out from them or the parents or the carers. So that I think that's really important. So actually making it a two-way communication dialogue and understanding what's important for them and how best you can communicate with them individually is a really important skill to master, but one that can be really beneficial to be an effective communicator.
I was just going to ask, off the back of what you were saying before, if you were to go into that same situation where perhaps you kind of something had come to you quite quickly and you hadn't had chance to kind of read up all you needed to do about it, or how would you approach a lesson like that now, do you think?
Yeah, I think, I mentioned, about the importance of being authentic and honest. And, looking back now, I was probably only about 3 or 4 years older than the class I was teaching then, so, going back into that environment and maybe being honest with them at the start that I had been thrown in a little bit at the deep end in the fact that I was teaching a lesson that I wasn't particularly comfortable with. It was one of the first lessons I'd ever taught. And, probably that honesty with the class would have gone a long way and probably been a much more effective lesson, because then we could have probably, had different tasks rather than me just standing at the front talking. It could have been a little bit more in terms of them, finding things out for themselves and maybe, presenting back to the group and things like that, which would have been a much more engaging lesson, I would imagine, for them than me reading my script out at the start of at the front of the class and then being bored to tears. So, but again, all these things, and the coaches listening will be the same, that all these things, whether it's communication or practice design or delivery, all come from experience. And, I think it's important, we often talk about that reflection, and that reflection on what you're doing is so key, because then that allows you to improve, and that's exactly the same for being an effective communicator. If you're reflecting on how you're communicating, then you can always probably find little things that you can do better to make it even more effective.
Yeah, definitely. It's always good looking at things in hindsight, isn't it? How you would change it. Yeah. When you are talking to players, how important is it to be mindful of your body language, would you say?
Yeah, I think it's vital, and I think the research suggests it's about 55% of your communication actually comes from your body language. So that's so important. And I've mentioned play phase, and that's something that we really emphasise when creating the play phase philosophy, because particularly with those initial interactions with our youngest children coming into the game, that can have such an impact on whether they want to stay in football or not. And if I think back to my nephew and his early experiences of football, he went to a few different clubs and sessions, but there was one that he loved more than any other, and that wasn't because the coach was a tactical genius or knew the ins and outs of the high press. It was essentially because of the manner of the coach, and was always so welcoming in terms of their communication and body language. He'd always greet every child with a massive smile and a name and a high five, and from a body language point of view, be jumping around enthusiastically and having fun himself, which then that transferred onto the players. Whereas, I think you'll know yourselves, if you see a coach who's maybe standing there with their hands in their pocket, slouched down, doesn't look very interested, then, that's probably going to rub off on the players and you're not going to get the best out of them. I think in terms of body language, something that's really helped me is watching back videos of when I've been coaching. It can be a real eye-opener to what your body language looks like and how the players might be interpreting it. And I think, that's something that can be a really effective tool if coaches get a chance to do that, because you probably do notice things that you think, oh, hang on, I can't believe I've been doing that. And that could have looked like this to a player when I didn't mean it to. So again, it's, a little bit of self-assessment to help you improve. And again, from my own experience, something that really made me realise the power of body language was when I taught and coached in Spain for a couple of years, and I was either communicating in my second language or the player's second language. So that really emphasised how important your body was and actions were to actually get messages across, because I didn't always have the words to actually say verbally what I wanted to do. So, the actions and the body language actually, were vital to be able to get those key things across.
Yeah, it's a really interesting way of thinking about like how if you don't have words as the first thing to go to, your body is the kind of second backup.
Yeah, and ultimately it does have a bit of you might not think it, but it does have a big impact on who's in front of you, who you're coaching realistically. Like say, if you kind of slump shoulders, like hands in the pockets, a little bit disinterested, then how can we expect, players to be interested and motivated in any sessions?
Absolutely. And I think it's the same, isn't it? When, if you walk into any room, then, you'll look and you start to make judgments on people based on the body language about, especially if you go into a room where you don't know people, who is it you're going to approach, who are you going to speak to? And it's the ones who've got that open body language, the smile, look like they're friendly and want to engage with you, that you'll go to. And I think, remembering that, like I said, particularly when in the work done in play phase with those children who are 4 and 5, and probably the first experience of actually going to something and, like that, and that welcoming body language is so important to, like I said, make them want to keep coming back.
Thinking of another kind of aspect of communication, what impact also can kind of like a change in tone, manner, or even volume have when you're speaking to your players?
Yeah, I think it's really important, particularly when you're out on the grass delivering a session. Your tone, your manner, your volume, like you mentioned, are really important. And I think, again, going back to early in my career, maybe particularly when I was being observed or assessed, and I've tried to be, during a session, constantly energetic and loud in order to impress. And, that's made the session become about me and rather than the players. And the players have probably actually switched off to the information I was trying to give, because I just became a constant noise in the background rather than, varying things. So, if you can vary your tone and the volume throughout the session, that can really help to dictate the tempo at appropriate times. So, if I give an example, if I'm delivering, let's say, an out of possession session, which involves my players pressing, then at moments, if I want them to close the opposition down quickly and win the ball back, then that might be the time when I raise my voice. It might be a time when I, encourage and speak quickly, and that'll dictate the tempo of what I want them to do. Whereas at times when I want them to maybe drop off and sit back, I might be more relaxed, a bit calmer, softer spoken in terms of a way of managing the situation. So I think, the volume, the tone, the manner that you have can be, vital in terms of actually dictating the tempo of the session. And then I think it's also important when we're speaking to the players individually. And, it goes back to something, we keep mentioning about knowing the players and how you speak to each of those players individually. And again, I've had players who, if I've spoken to maybe with a raised, firmer voice because I needed to get a message across, some might react in a way that motivates them, whereas others might react in a way where actually I feel like I'm being criticised, and that might affect the performance. And, I think being mindful of your tone, your volume and your manner are critical in terms of developing groups of players, but also the relationships that you have with individuals as well. So yeah, I think along with body language, they're vital in terms of how we effectively communicate.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to take away there for anyone listening or watching, is just getting to know your players and what gets the best out of them. It's not a one kind of solution fits all approach. It is just knowing what's best for them. And I think I've probably said this example or this story before on the podcast in terms of one little trick that I was kind of taught on a course before with tone, manner, and volume was just like, if people are maybe not paying attention a little bit, or maybe a little bit excited, and I think it was kind of like, I think they told me just like to try and kind of lower like my voice, like the volume sort of thing, and then all of a sudden they kind of pick up and go, oh, we might actually be missing out on something here. And funnily enough, it did actually work. It doesn't mean it's going to work every time, but people did actually come around and go, oh, actually, you need to say something important here, and we're actually missing out.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I think particularly having had, 10 years as a teacher as well in the classrooms every day, that, those little tips and tricks, are so important for getting the best out of classes. And I think also, linked to that, moments of silence can be really powerful as well. You can probably think about when you were at school as well, and I've still got this one teacher in my mind as well, that when they were silent, just stood at the front, everybody became silent because they knew, right, well, we need to listen now, because if they're silent, that means we have to be silent. And I think it's the same when we're coaching a football session as well. We've got to be able to give the players opportunities to make decisions for themselves. And, sometimes if we're constantly speaking, then they don't get the opportunity to do that, because it's like we're talking them through the game. So, and those moments of silence can be really powerful as well, and gives you an opportunity to actually observe what's going on.
I was just thinking as well how tiring it could be to all just be at one level the whole time as a coach. So even giving you the difference in approach to things and levels and volumes and what have you is probably better for you as a coach to kind of just make sure you don't burn out halfway through.
Yeah, absolutely. And, again, going back to, like I referred to, I certainly remember, during my training year as a teacher, and when someone was coming to observe me, and like I said, I was so kind of hyped up for it, and I was doing probably 10,000 more steps than the kids were in the PE lesson, because I was just everywhere and being energetic. But again, it just became constant noise to the children, as opposed to actually listening to what I was saying, because I was just in the background. And like you said, I was absolutely shattered after the lessons because of how much energy I'd put into it. Whereas, we want to certainly use our communication to dictate the session or the lesson, but what we don't want is it to overcome everything else and be the session. So, those moments of changing tone and volume and also silence are really important, and getting it right at the right times.
Talking about like getting it right at the right times, like, do you have any tips to help people with with their communication, whether it be tone, manner, and volume, or body language, like on a match day? Because appreciate a lot of people might find it stressful, or in some cases, depending what the coaching context is to anybody listening or watching, that 3 points is actually that they're needing to go for instance. Like, do you have any tips just to be like, to try and keep the consistency sort of thing of their communication, no matter whether it's training or match day?
It's a great question, that, because I think match day can provide lots of different challenges to training, such as there's probably a lot more eyes on a match day in terms of on you as a coach and what you were doing. There might be more pressure to get a result depending on the context. There might be nerves from you and the players. But, it goes back to something we talked about earlier, which is I think it's really important to be yourself in both contexts, whether that's training or a match day, and being authentic. And it might feel, quite tempting to feel like you've got to put on a show or a performance for the parents or the crowd who are watching. But it's worth remembering that a match day, particularly in youth football, is essentially it's just an extension of the player's development, like training. And it's not a separate entity, it's just another milestone in their development. So, I think remembering that and being authentic is really important. And said it before, but your players will soon work out if you're not being yourself and you're putting on an act, because they'll know you. So I think it's also, like we touched on in training, it's also definitely possible to over communicate on a match day as well. Whether that's to try and embed too many tactical messages before the game or at half time or even during the game. Just sprung to mind there. I know I've had in the past where I've actually had a parent come up to me and say, it looked like I didn't care as much as the opposition manager because I was quite quiet on the touchline in relation to them. And, I wasn't jumping around and screaming and shouting like they were. But, my justification was that, that's not my natural personality. If I suddenly started doing that, the players are going to wonder what's going on. And, like we said, we can't expect our players to become good decision makers if we are constantly talking them through the game and making decisions for them. But, what we can do is use calm communication to guide them at appropriate times and have confidence in the work that you've done together prior to the match day. you don't need to be giving all the information on the match day. Hopefully that's just seeing some of the things that you've worked on prior to it come out. So, having those really high standards as well is something that's important. And probably the critical thing is always reminding yourself that your communication is for the players, and it's not for everybody else watching. It's for your players. So having that in your back of the mind, I think, will always help.
It's a fascinating observation, isn't it, in terms of like that some people's maybe opinions of like effective communication, like you mentioned there, is like people jumping up and down on the touchline. You think about what you might see on Match of the Day sort of thing, like with the managers jumping up and down, shouting, and some obviously don't. But well, I know, obviously, being a fan and being in the stands, that some people's opinions of a manager on the touchline literally is how animated they actually are. But communication is so much more than that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's always remembering that as a coach, you were there to help the players, whether you're winning 4-0 or losing 4-0. I think when I was growing up as a player, I've had managers and coaches who might be kicking water bottles and throwing things about when we've conceded a goal. And, for me as a player, that didn't really help, because it just kind of increased the negativity of the situation of conceding the goal. So, staying calm is so important, and that allows you to make some positive decisions to help the team. You mentioned, I think a great example of that is of managing emotions was Steve Holland during Euro 2024 when Ollie Watkins scored the last minute winner in the semi-final. He didn't start celebrating wildly. He remained really calm, and started discussing with Gareth what substitutions needed to be made in order to secure the game in the last couple of minutes. Now, if he'd been celebrating, running up and down the touchline, then he wouldn't have been able to do that. So, probably the message would be to remember the bigger picture of the whole game and try not to get caught up in individual moments, which is certainly difficult, on a match day, especially, when if you're in an environment where results are so important, it's certainly a chance to do that. But, if you can, and like Steve Holland did in that, one of the most critical moments and high profile moments, to be able to do that, I think is an amazing skill. And, remembering that bigger picture will give you that clarity of mind to be able to make some positive decisions and ultimately to help the players. And, something, again, linked to what I mentioned earlier around, helping yourself to be able to do that. Something I've done is, just have a little, start an audio note on your phone when you're coaching with a microphone, and, on the way home, listening to some of the things that you might have said. And again, that can be a very powerful learning experience. It can also, you might hear things and think, oh, I'm not sure, how the player might have interpreted that, or I can't believe I said that. I don't even remember saying that. But, again, it's another powerful tool in terms of reflecting on how you're communicating. So that can be really useful, even if it is a little bit, makes you cringe a little bit when you are listening back to it.
On the topic of like listening or listening back to yourself, would you say that to be an effective communicator, that being a good listener is also really important?
To be honest, I don't think you can be an effective communicator without being a good listener. And I think it's not just listening to what people say, but also, we talked about body language and actually listening to their body language and what they are doing. We need to be able to understand the players' wants and needs in order to give them the best possible experience. And, observing the players and listening to the feedback that they're giving can take a bit of bravery, but it can also allow you to give them that better experience. I think we've all probably, all the coaches listening have probably been there when, you're in the middle of a session and you say, right, we're doing this practice or this activity next, and you see a few players' heads drop or they start to moan and groan, and that probably tells you everything you need to know about what to think of it. But then, on the other hand, the best feeling is if a player runs up to you and say, oh, can we do this that we did last week? Because, that's ultimately, the body language and what they're saying is telling you, right, well, they enjoyed that. Let's, can we incorporate that into what we're doing again? And, I think, that listening skill and listening to the players and actually taking on board what they say is also brilliant for developing positive relationships with them, because, it's showing the players that you actually care about what they are feeling. It's not just all about you and what you think, it's actually about them. And, a couple of examples from my work, in PE, we often talk about pupil choice and voice. Same within play phase, giving children the ownership in terms of the task that they might be doing, in terms of equipment that they might be playing with, or opportunities to create their own games. We've mentioned earlier as well about, coaching disabled footballers and understanding players' needs in general, but maybe particularly with disabled players who might need you to listen to information about them, which could really help you to help them. And it might be something that you haven't actually thought about. I think, probably one of the other things we can listen to is actually why the players are there in the first place. And I think, particularly when they get to kind of secondary school age, they can be there for very different reasons. You might have some who are there who, are there because they have ambitions to be a professional in the game. You might have others there when it gets 12, 13 who are there just because they enjoy kicking the ball about with their mates, and that's what they're there for. And so, understanding that and listening to why they're actually there can help you to shape their learning experience and tailor it to them. So it's what they want to get out of it. So, that listening, like we said, whether it's listening to what they're verbally saying or listening to body language and their actions is so important, and, a massive part of the effective communication that we're talking about.
We've talked a lot about, so we've kind of covered body language, we've talked about listening and kind of like manner, tone, volume. There's a lot of stuff for people to take in there when it comes to communication. So if you was to kind of summarise it into, and this might be difficult, I'm not saying that it's going to be easy, but if you was kind of summarise it into like, what's the most important thing that for a coach to kind of remember when they're going to communicate with their players?
I think it's something that we've talked about a lot, but I'd say the most important thing is knowing who you are communicating with. So, which sounds really simple, but the better you know the players or the pupils that you're working with, the better you understand what their wants and needs are, then the better you can communicate with them. So, again, it sounds really simple, but my advice would be that if you know who you are communicating to, then you can communicate with them much more effectively than if you don't. So just getting to understand as much about them as possible will really help. So I'd say that's probably the most important thing in terms of communication, because like you said right at the start, everybody's unique, everybody's an individual, so everybody needs communicating to and with in unique and individual ways. So the more we know about a person, the better we can do that.
And is that kind of key to, I suppose, like being able to actually plan for communication? And if so, is that actually something that you do yourself?
Yeah, I'd say that's probably one of the biggest changes or things that has evolved in my own planning process from where I started out, in terms of actually planning questions and incorporating those into what it is that I'm delivering. Whether these might be, whole group question and answers parts in the session to gauge the understanding of a topic, or there might be individual questions or interventions, based on the position or the role that you're asking them to play in the system. And, I think that's something that, not just personally, but it's been great to see more and more over recent years when observing coaches is coaches using like drive-by interventions during sessions to speak to players one-on-one as the game continues, rather than stopping the whole session. And again, something I was definitely guilty of at the start of my career was saying stop, stand still too often, and then giving an instruction to just one or two players while the rest of them stood around there getting cold and bored and probably disengaging with the session. And we've probably already been there when you're in a session. That's the worst thing you can hear as a player is, right, stop, stand still, because you just want to play. And so those little drive-by interventions and planned questions and, topics of conversation that you can have with individual based on their own needs is vital. And, in my role, fortunate to get to work and observe lots of coaches. And that's something that I'm seeing more and more often, is actually planned interventions within the session plan. So it's not just the coaching points, it's not just what practices I'm going to do, but it's actually, right, these are some questions that I might ask at this point in the session. These are the questions that I'm going to ask to this individual to gauge their understanding. And, I think that's really, really important part of the planning and delivery process to be an effective coach.
It's almost really helpful as well to know when you're going to do those things. So you're not having to be everywhere all at once and kind of communicating with everybody in all different ways. You could almost like plan that you're going to do some bits of communication with some people and talk about some things on one session and different things on another.
Probably something that probably haven't reiterated enough today is that power of observation in order to be able to effectively communicate. And, as a lot of the coaches who are listening will know, we use the 6 capabilities, and these can be a really powerful framework to use just to actually, spend a couple of minutes actually just watching a player. And, while watching them either in a game or in training, we can then give them some really specific feedback for them. So, for example, you might watch a player for 2 minutes in training, and you might notice that the player is misplacing passes because of something like, the body, the position of their body when they strike the ball, for example, or they might be getting caught in possession when they receive because they haven't taken information in through scanning before the ball arrives. So gathering that information then allows you to go in and speak to that player and communicate with the player to help them and adapt what they're doing so that they can have more success. So, I think, again, giving yourself the opportunity to actually gather information which can help you to communicate is really key as well. And not just going in with a predetermined, right, I'm going to get this across, this across, this across. It's a case of, right, well, what information can you give them? How can you communicate them based on what it is that you're actually seeing? And, other methods that we might use, setting like clear success criteria for a session so that you and the players, and we mentioned it right at the start in the top tips in terms of if you've got some clear objectives, then they're really clear about what it is that they're going after. And I think it's also worth remembering that the communication doesn't always have to come from you as the coach. If the players have a clear understanding of what you're looking for, then they can start to peer assess and help each other to get better by giving appropriate feedback. So then the communication, increases by tenfold because then they can all communicate and help each other as opposed to you just helping individuals or groups at a time.
It's really useful to hear that there are lots of different ways that you can do it and just make people think about the ways that they might approach different situations. How would you know which method to use and when? Is it just by experience, or is this kind of a rule that you go by?
I think, a lot of it does come from, like you said, experience. Again, going back to the players, the individuals, the groups that you've worked with, how much opportunity you've had to work with them. In a lot of cases, it might be, questioning and answering based on previous work that you've done with them. If it's a group that you're working with for the first time, it might be a little bit of question and answer based on just to gauge what their starting point is. A little bit of, guided discovery in terms of, not giving them all the answers, but helping them to get there themselves. Whereas, sometimes there might be those occasions and, particularly in performance environments where, you've got 15 minutes at half time. If you need to get messages to the players, then you're going to be very much command style. Right, I want you to do this, and this in the second half. So I think it's very much based on context in terms of what's the best method at the most appropriate time, and again, understanding individuals where they're at in terms of their moment in learning and how much you've had the opportunity to work with that group or that squad of players. And I think probably one message you get across based on that question is that it's not a case of, right, I'm a command style coach or I'm a question and answer coach. It's having that toolkit so that you can use lots of different methods, and using the appropriate ones at different times is a really valuable skill to be able to employ.
So Ryan, we've talked about quite a lot of things and shared a lot of tips to help people with the communication skills. But one thing that we've not really touched on that will likely impact how you communicate with your team is kind of the age and stage that you're actually working with. So can you give us some tips to help our audience communicate effectively when they're working with different age groups?
Yeah, I'd say probably the most critical thing is that age-appropriate language. I think particularly, in football environments, when we're talking about technical and tactical elements of the game, if we take some terms or phrases that, things like press, squeeze up, switch, pivot, they probably aren't going to mean much to the youngest players. So it's important that to make our language clear, simple and understandable for the players that we've got in front of us. One of my favourite play phase games is Sharks and Fishes, which, from a tactical point of view, is essentially developing compactness as a defensive unit. But a 5-year-old doesn't need to hear that. All they need to know is that if they work with the other sharks and stay close together, then it's going to be hard for the fish to swim through them. So, later on in their journey, then we can start to introduce more specific terminology and concepts as and when they're ready. And knowing what interests they might have outside of football as well. This can really help you in terms of introducing, exciting themes into your sessions and communicate messages in different ways. Another one, game we use working with Key Stage 1 teachers is something called like an aeroplane game, where the players have got to get past air traffic controllers who are chasing after them, giving them speeding tickets, and they've got to look after their passenger, which is the ball. And again, essentially, it's developing lots of attacking and defending principles. But as far as those children in year 1 are concerned, they're just aeroplanes flying about from airport to airport as fast as they can. So it's really really important to make sure that we are being as appropriate as possible in terms of language. And from my own experience, something that springs to mind, when I taught at an international school, and I actually taught PE from reception class, so the 4-year-olds right up to sixth form. And I actually had a day on my timetable where I taught reception first lesson, then I was teaching sixth form, then year 1, and then back to sixth form. And so constantly adapting my communication to speak to 4 and 5-year-olds and then to 18-year-olds. And, sixth forms would soon let you know if you spoke to them like they were 5 years old. But, it's again, probably another example of, adapting to speak to different groups. And it's the same as anything in life, isn't it? How you speak at work might be different to how you might speak to your family, you might be able to speak to friends, and you're constantly adapting how you communicate. And I think football environments are exactly the same.
Yeah, it's a really good way of. I bet that was a big learning curve that day in particular, but
it was, yeah.
Really interesting thinking of it in those terms. Like if you were to switch between, what would you change and how would you change it? So we heard earlier about your work with the para teams, so it'd be really good to get some of your insight on this. So for any coaches who have players with additional needs, do you have any further useful tips to help them communicate effectively with their players?
Yeah, I think the message, would be to understand the needs of the players by speaking to them and their parents and the carers, and maybe learning as much as possible about them and their additional needs. As part of our new Coaching Disabled Footballers online module, we have a range of support cards and resources for a variety of disabilities, which, provide information on the disability and also on methods to help the person who might have that disability in a football environment. So, some of those examples that we've referred to might be things like structure boards, so like pictures as methods of communication. So players can see exactly what's going to be happening in the session and in what order, without verbally telling them. Also, we use things like emojicon cards, so the players can let you know in a non-verbal way how they might be feeling. So that can really help you in terms of managing them in the session. Other ones, such as, BSL for deaf players, or, making sure that the player is in front of you at all times if the deaf player lip reads. Obviously, in deaf football, things like flags are used instead of whistles. And something else which is amazing within the para teams, we use an app so that, we have a microphone and what we are saying comes up on a screen in real time, which is, amazing technology for the deaf players, and has made communication, taking it to the next level. And, last time I was on, we talked a lot about colour blindness. So again, using appropriate colours when communicating with players is really important, especially when referring to tactics boards or bibs. And there are obviously, hundreds of hints and tips for effectively communicating with different needs of players. So my main advice would be to speak to the player, find out what works for them, and have a look at the Coach Disabled Footballers workshop, which I said has got lots of free to access ideas and resources, which I think can really help coaches.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
Right, well, looking back at everything we've discussed, which we've covered quite a lot in the time, so thank you very much for that, Ryan. Can you kind of summarise the key top tips on communication that you would like all of the listeners to take away today?
Yeah, so I think my top 3 tips would be to ensure that communication with players is a two-way process. So you are listening to their thoughts, their feelings, their feedback to make it a real positive and player-centred environment. I think number 2 would be keep your messages clear and concise, using that age and stage appropriate language we've talked about, remembering that every player is an individual with their own unique communication needs. And, finally, I'd say constantly seek feedback and reflect on your communication in order to help make it even more effective. And this can be, getting feedback from other coaches, from your players, or through things like we've mentioned, like, videoing yourself or audio recordings, and always looking to improve yourself and your communication methods even further.
Perfect. And if we were to ask you to set our listeners a challenge, something to kind of get them to help start improving their communication a little bit, what would you suggest that they do?
It's probably something that, we have mentioned a few times today, but I think it's something that I didn't start to do until later in my coaching career, which was actually at the end of sessions or even during sessions, actually ask the players, right, well, what do you think of that? What if we were going to do that again, what would you want me to do differently? And again, it takes a little bit of bravery to do that, because particularly children can be very honest with you, but that's what you need. And I think it's exactly the same when it comes to communication, and actually seeking the feedback from the players, and you'll work out maybe players within the squad who will give you that honest feedback. And so you can say about, right, during half time, did the messages that I want to get across, did I get those across or not? And if the answer is yes, brilliant. If it's no, then right, well, what could I have done better to get that message across? And so, yeah, my challenge would be to put yourself out there, show a little bit of bravery, and actually ask your players in terms of, well, what's my communication like? What messages does my body language say to you when I'm on the sideline? Or what messages does my body language send to you when you first arrive? And I would imagine that the coach listening will, probably get some interesting things back, just like I've done when I've done that. But again, it can be really powerful and allow you to reflect and really help you to improve how you are communicating with the players.
Yeah, so be brave and give it a Yeah.
You do have to be brave when you get an honest opinion from players, especially if you've just lost a game as well.
Yeah, it would be really interesting to find out, what kind of feedback people are getting and how it makes them feel and what they decide to do with it next. So, do let us know if you've given it a go.
Yeah, feel free to share in the comments how that's gone. Well, Ryan, we are coming up to the end of the show now, and you've just given our listeners a bit of a challenge, and we're kind of going to end on a challenge for yourself, because it is time for our Swift session feature.
Yep. So you've done this before, so it's not new to you, but a 30-second challenge to explain to us a session idea in those 30 seconds. Are you up for giving it a go again?
Yep, absolutely.
When the music starts, you can begin.
So I'm going to share a session on the subject of today, which is effective communication, and it's a brilliant game for players to effectively communicate and develop that. So it's one we call 3 in a row. So to picture it, just think of human noughts and crosses. You've got 2 teams of 3 players in a 3x3 box grid, just like noughts and crosses. Both teams start in the middle of the square, and when you say go, they've got to work together to communicate with each other and be the first team to get in a line of 3 in any direction to win that round.
Perfect. So good at these.
Oh, great. That was a good idea. Thanks for that, Ryan. And thank you once again for joining us online today and giving us an insight into both what you've been up to, but also some really, really fascinating and some really good insight on your communication methods and some top tips to be able to share with everyone. So, yeah, thank you very much for that.
No, you're welcome, and thank you very much for having me back on. I really appreciate it.
Anytime.
Absolutely, anytime. Like you see, hopefully we'll soon have you on for your hat-trick appearance.
Absolutely.
I hope so. Right, well, that's all we have time for today, but don't forget to check out the description for the transcription of this episode and for all the links to our platforms. There you'll be able to click through to the England football community, and this is where you can post your coaching questions for us to discuss on the podcast, or just simply to connect with loads of wonderful coaches.
Yep, we'd love to help you out with your coaching questions, so please do check it out. We'll be back soon with another episode of Coachcast, so if you haven't already, hit subscribe to make sure you don't miss an episode. From all of us at England Football Learning, thanks for listening.